Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing the course in medieval church history. Today we begin a new unit on the Merovingians. This brings us back into the story of the successor kingdoms to the ancient Roman Empire, which collapsed in the year 476 AD with the deposition of the last Western Emperor Romulus Augustulus on September 4th of that year. Recall that the Vandals, a Scandinavian barbarian tribe, created a successor kingdom out of what had been Roman North Africa. It lasted for a century until the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I invaded and destroyed it, returning North Africa to the status of an imperial province, which the Byzantines called an exarchate. This lasted for an additional 2 centuries until the entirety of North Africa was conquered by Islam, after which the region was lost to the Christian world and remains Islamic to this day. The Ostrogoths, a collection of Germanic tribes, created another successor kingdom out of Italy, which lasted 60 years, until it was destroyed by Justinian, and for a time returned to provincial status. Unfortunately, this endeavor failed because Justinian relied in part on foederati. In this case, the Longobards, who are, that name was euphemised to Lombards, who betrayed him and carved out a kingdom for themselves in northern Italy, with their capital at Ticinum, which is now Pavia. The Byzantines, though they never did get all of Italy back, they did retain naval bases at a few Italian ports. The governor who ruled over as much of Italy as they could hold was the Exarch of Ravenna in northeastern Italy. The Visigoths, another collection of Germanic tribes, created yet another successor kingdom, the Regnum Visigothorum, comprised initially of southwestern France and Spain, that lasted for 3 centuries. And keep in mind, with the United States is not 3 centuries old yet. I mean, counting from the Declaration of Independence, it's 244 years old as of 2020. The Visigoths lost the French portion of their kingdom to the Merovingians in the year 507, as we'll see shortly, and they lost Spain to the Muslims, who invaded Spain in 711 and completed, or took as much of Spain as they did take, by 721, as we covered in the unit on Islam. The Muslims then established their own successor kingdom out of what had been a portion of the Western Empire in Spain, which they called Al-Andalus, and that was euphemised into medieval Latin as Andalusia. The Anglo-Saxons created 7 successor kingdoms out of Roman Britain, which were initially pagan. The Anglo-Saxons were pagan. This is the kingdoms of Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Wessex. As we covered in the session on Pope Gregory the Great, Roman missionaries in the south and Celtic missionaries in the north converted these Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to Catholicism. The remaining areas of the old empire will occupy our attention during this unit on the Merovingians, and as well as the generations after. They'll be followed by the Carrolingians, which would bring us to Charlemagne, who was the first Holy Roman Emperor to reunite some of the old Western Empire with and connect it to parts of Germany which had never been part of the empire. But you know, nothing just happens. So there's a lot to explain for this. So this is France and Germany, but with the Merovingians, it's mostly France and Belgium that'll occupy our attention. So France. France is named for the Franks, originally a collection of Germanic tribes that entered the Roman Empire as foederati, ostensibly to defend the region that now bears their name on behalf of Rome. Instead, they carved it into multiple kingdoms, just as the Anglo-Saxons did to England. In the case of France, it was 4 main kingdoms, with 2 others that periodically asserted independence. How that sorry state of affairs transpired will now be explained. Among the Franks, the larger group of Franks, Germanic, ethnically and linguistically Germanic, of course they had divisions within them. So among the Franks, the first family to assert overwhelming dominance over all the rest call themselves the Merovingians, honoring their warrior ancestor Merovec. Merovec distinguished himself among the foederati of the late empire by temporarily returning to imperial loyalty long enough to successfully defeat Attila the Hun at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in Gaul, present-day France, around Chalon in present-day France, in the year 451. Merovec's grandson, Clovis, became the founder of the Frankish kingdom. So he was the first of the Merovingians to claim the title Rex, king. In the Salian Frank dialect, his name, Clovis's name, was Lodovig. That was initially Latinized into Clodovecus. Later, that was simplified into Clovis. In longer-term French history, Clodovecus became Ludovicus. Ludovicus got contracted into Luvis, then Louis, or Louis, and in the German, Ludwig. So Louis and Ludwig actually come from Clovis, even though initially it doesn't look it, but it's Clodovecus. Clovis was 10 years old when the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476 AD. Now, we know, in retrospect, that Romulus Augustulus was the last Western Roman emperor, but those living in 476 when he was deposed had no way of knowing that. Emperors had been deposed before, so it was entirely possible that another emperor would gather enough troops to assert himself, or that the Eastern emperors would simply reunite the empire, as had been done a few times, most recently from their perspective, by Theodosius I, who reunited it until his death in 395, in the previous century. So with that in mind, it's easier to understand the situation in Roman Gaul, present-day France, at the time. A Roman general named Syagrius, remained loyal to the empire and functioned as a dux limites. Dux is at the time duke. It evolved into duke, but originally it was a title in the late empire in the Byzantine usage, describing one who would defend a border region, the dux bellorum, a war duke. In this case, and the limites were simply the border, so he was defending the border. His base was at Noviodunum, which is present-day Soissons, 62 miles northeast of Lutetia, which is now Paris. He defended the territory between the rivers Loire and Somme, the Somme, for 10 years after the last Western emperor was deposed, awaiting the return of imperial government. He was a good soldier. He was, just staying at his post. Southern Gaul, southern France, had already been lost to the Visigoths, who created a successor kingdom for themselves, the kingdom of Tolosa. Tolosa is now Toulouse in France, while Eastern Gaul was lost to the Burgundians, who we'll talk about in a minute. The consistent problem Syagrius had in the decade following the deposition of the Emperor Romulus was the Salian Franks, ethnic Germans accepted into the empire who walked the well-trodden path of betrayal that all the other Foederati did. In 432, before the empire had even fallen, the Salian Franks seized Tournacum, that's Tournai in present-day Belgium, and used it as their tribal capital. During the chiefdom of Clovis's father, who had the unfortunate name of Childeric, the Salians confined themselves to raids against the Dux Limites Noviodunum, Soissons, where Syagrius was defending. But when Childeric died in 481, 5 years after the Western Emperor was deposed, his son Clovis became chieftain, and he decided on conquest. Instead of just raiding, decided on conquest. The choice of Clovis to conquer Noviodunum, to conquer Soissons, and add it to the Salian Franks' domain of present-day Belgium, culminated in the Battle of Soissons in 486 AD. This battle was both a tactical and a strategic victory for Clovis. Subsequently, it was a strategic victory because subsequently the Gallo-Romans, like Syagrius, were no longer militarily viable. And tactically it was a victory because he won the day, he won the field. And Syagrius survived the battle, but he fled. He was later captured and stabbed to death by the Visigoths in Tolosa as a gift to Clovis. This victory doubled the size of the Salian Frank territory, bringing them south to the Loire River. And the Loire at the time was the border with the Visigoth successor kingdom of Tolosa. This, of course, was a temporary arrangement because Clovis had ambitions. We know this because after the Battle of Soissons, he began referring to himself as Rex Francorum, King of the Franks. It was not King of France yet because they didn't yet have that idea of France as a nation state, but so it was King of the Franks, and therefore of the territory conquered by the Franks. It's just because later that did become a nation state of France that we think of it, but at the time they would not have said King of France. He's King of the Franks. And so now he has conquered territory, and so he starts making the map for himself. So his late father's realm was designated as the Osterreich, the East Kingdom, and that became hybridized, as the Franks, of course, have their own language, the Germanic language, but they're living among the old imperials who still speak Latin. So that Osterreich became hybridized as the Regnum Austrasiae, or Austrasia, which just means the East Kingdom. And that included Belgium, northeastern France, and northwestern Germany to Fulda, east to Fulda. And the capital of Austrasia was at Metz, M-E-T-Z. Metz is 206 miles east of Paris. The newly conquered territory, the Dux Limites Noviodunum, the Soissons, was designated as the Regnum Neustriae, or the New Western Kingdom, hybridized into Neustrasia or Neustria. That included western France, and within which was Lutetia, the present-day Paris. But initially, the capital was at Soissons, at Noviodunum. As for the rest of the old imperial Gaul, the Scandinavian Bornholm Islanders from the Baltic created a successor kingdom out of eastern central France and southeastern France, and as well as Switzerland and Alpine Italy. They never made it in, they never crossed the Alps into Italy, but like Transalpine Italy, on the northern and the western and the northwestern side of the Alps. In Old Norse, their language, their home was called Burgundarholm, or the island of the Burgundians. So that name of their kingdom was euphemised from Burgundarholmer into Burgundy, or Burgundy, if you like the beverages produced in the region. Southern Gaul had a more complicated history, and so at this point I have to resort to try to do this with a map. It's hard to hold this thing. Okay, so this is present-day France, and I can't see up here. Oh, yeah. Okay, so this is Paris. So the area around Paris, that was Neustria, even though the capital was at Soissons. And so this is the Western Frankish Rite, but this was their conquest. Their homeland was up here in Belgium. Well, not their homeland, but after they, because they came from Germany. But when they came into the empire as Foederati, and the first area they stole was Belgica, which Roman Belgium. So that was called Austrasia, included Belgium, Luxembourg, and into Germany. And so now down here in the south, let's see, we're going to talk about Bordeaux, Aquitaine down here, and the area on the on the coast, in the south, Provence, Aquitaine, Provence, which the Romans, and that was Septimania, was because it's where the 7th Legion was that guarded the road. And so cities like Arles, Marseille, the port. Let's see, Marseille's further over. I can't see. Okay, there's Marseille. Is the port, Massalia in antiquity. And this area over here is Burgundy, so the Franche-Comté and the Bourgogne on this map. Yeah, so this Bourgogne, that's Burgundy, and then the Franche-Comté, that's the whole area of Burgundy over into Switzerland, which the Romans called Helvetia. So you have Austrasia up here, Neustria here, and you have Aquitaine, Tolosa, Septimania, which Provence down here, and Burgundy, or Burgundy, however you want to say it here. So Paris, orient yourself by Paris up here, Belgium, and then way down here, Bordeaux and Aquitaine. And this is the Pyrenees, a mountain chain between France and Spain. Okay. So southern Gaul. South of the Loire River, between the Loire River and the Pyrenees Mountains, and from the Atlantic coast, Bordeaux, over to the Alps, was part of the Visigoth successor kingdom, which they lost part of to the Burgundians, and they lost the other part to the Franks in 507, to the Merovingians, as we'll see in a moment. Julius Caesar, for those fans of ancient history, we talked about this in the patristics course, but or if you even knew Latin, if you ever had Caesar's commentaries inflicted on you, his commentaries on the campaigns in Gaul, he referred to the region as the southern France as Gallia Aquitania, long-haired Gaul. And throughout the Middle Ages, that term Aquitaine stuck for southern France, particularly southwestern France, around the Bordeaux region. During the later empire, around 392, it was subdivided. Actually, earlier than that, it was by Diocletian, so around 305. It was subdivided into first Aquitania Prima, with the capital at, it was Bitergum, but Bourges, now Bourges, the city of Bourges in France. Aquitania Secunda, second Aquitaine, is the one with the capital at Bordeaux, Bertigala for the Romans, on the southwestern coast. And third Aquitaine, Aquitania Tertia, is in the south, and that's sort of Provence. And Septimania. Septimania was also in southern France, Carcassonne and Narbonne, cities down to the Pyrenees. That's was Septimania called, because there's a road that's there's still roads that connect Arelate and Arles. It's like on the Pilgrim Road to Compostela. So the 7th Legion guarded that for centuries, and so it's still called the Septimania after them. Okay, so the Merovingians, the Merovingian practice, which was in accord with Salian Frank law, included 3 constructs that ensured the Merovingians would not survive. First, they functionally subdivided their realm among each son with each generation. Yet they considered the realm, they considered the Merovingian realm, the Regnum Francorum, to be one. Like they considered the kingdom of the Franks, they considered it one kingdom, but they subdivided it among their sons, 3 or 4 sons, however many in a generation. These regions, Neustria, Austrasia, later Aquitaine, Septimania, they were divided among their sons. And their sons would take the title Rex, king, king of Neustria, or whatever. But they still considered it part of the Merovingian domain. They considered it unitary, but still divided it administratively among their sons. So, of course, that was doomed. So as a result, sometimes there would only be one king of all of it. At other times, there would be a king of Neustria, another king of Austrasia, another king of Burgundy, another king of Aquitaine, another king of Provence, another king of Septimania. And yet the population was still expected to consider themselves part of the same Merovingian realm. Second, because of this revolving partition paradigm among the different numbers of sons in each generation, actual governance was applied by the senior official of the palace. The eventual title of this official followed the function. The Latin word for house is domus, so the house of the king. While the word for the greater in the sense of the senior official was major, or major, or mayor. So hence the mayor of the house, or the mayor of the palace, because the house of the king is the palace, that became the major domo. The effect was to diminish the monarchs, the Merovingian monarchs, to figureheads, with the lords of the realm turning to the mayors of the palace for policy, executive function, and most importantly of all, military leadership. So that meant, the Merovingian monarchy, had no hope. Third, among the duties of the mayor of the palace was serving as intermediary between the king and the other lords of the realm. In each generation of the redivision of the realms among the number of sons in that generation, this is the capital city of the eldest son, whatever his chosen realm was, would be the capital of the notionally united Regnum Francorum, kingdom of the Franks, Merovingian kingdom. The result being that the mayor of the palace and the machinery of the kingdom's government were moved, like the capital would move, between Metz, Soissons, Paris, sometimes Orléans. It just kept moving around. I mean, it's just ludicrous. And some kings would choose other cities, as if a choice of 4 or 5 wasn't enough. Some would go back to Belgium, to Tournai or Heristal. Complicating matters even more, because those 3 just, weren't enough. So just to add variety. At times, the Merovingian person ruling these sub-kingdoms, people, they waged war on each other. Sometimes brothers hate each other, and they wage war on each other because they hated him or they wanted to unite it. They wanted to do what Clovis did. They wanted to be king of everything. And each one would appoint his own mayor of the palace to accomplish this. Pick the best soldier to do this for him. And still, even that's not enough. Individual Merovingians who were not strong enough to rule one of these sub-kingdoms, but did have some support, could, and at times did, claim to be king of a particular city, even if that's all he had, but he could control that. He didn't have troops to control that and defend it. So you might have yet another king of Tolosa, or, a king of Massalia, king of Soissons. Even though Soissons was in the kingdom of Neustria, and you might have another Merovingian who was king of Neustria, with his capital at Lutetia, at Paris. Yet, maybe his nephew, might have enough troops to hold Soissons and just say, okay, well, I'm king of Soissons. Or another one might be Aurelianum, later Orleans. So it's really sad. I mean, it's hilarious, but it's also sad. So onto this sanguinary stage, we meet the first 2 Merovingian saints. This is, of course, on church history. So Saint Clotilde and Saint Genevieve. Saint Clotilde, or Clotilda, was born in 474 AD in the Burgundian capital of the moment, Lyon, which is present-day France. She was the daughter of King Chilperic II of Burgundy, at a time when the kingdom of Burgundy was divided into 3. Her father reigned at Lyon. Uncle Gundobad reigned at Vienne, not Vienna. Vienna is in Austria. Vienne is in France. And another uncle, Godegisil, reigned at Geneva, present-day Switzerland, but all that was part of Burgundy. By the time Clovis married St. Clotilde in 493, her parents had been assassinated by Uncle Gundobad, and she, Clotilde, was living with Uncle Godegisil. She and Clovis, after their marriage, Clotilde and Clovis, had 5 children, while her surviving sister, Crona, became a nun. After Clovis and St. Genevieve, the next saint we're going to talk about, after they both died, St. Clotilde retired to the Abbey of St. Martin in Tours, France. St. Genevieve, who is one of the patronesses of the city of Paris, was born in the year 422 at Nanterre. Then it was 7 miles north of Paris. Now it's a suburb. Genevieve's father, Severus, was a Gallo-Roman, an old imperial. Her mother, Geronica, was Greek. Remember, Greece was part of the empire. And when she was born in 422, the empire was still, I mean, they had an Eastern and Western emperor, but it was still one empire. So it was not unusual. At the age of 15, Genevieve decided to dedicate herself to God. She was not going to marry, as what we would think of as a religious sister. The canon law had not developed to that point. They did have Pachomian monasteries, communal monasteries, convents for women, but the idea of a religious order of women engaged in teaching, say, or medical care, that's something that developed later in ecclesiastical law as a construct of canon law. But functionally, it existed before, as you know, and she's an example of it. So she was not a cloistered nun, but she was a dedicated virgin, publicly dedicated so before the bishop, and she dedicated herself to works of charity, you know, the corporal works of mercy. When her parents died, Genevieve moved to Lutetia, which is now Paris, to live with her grandmother. There she continued her life of religion. The Bishop of Paris appointed her to lead and organize others like her, other dedicated virgins like herself, to organize their works more effectively. So essentially, this is like a proto or pre-proto religious community of women, non-cloistered. At the time, this was in the Roman province of Gaul, because the empire hadn't fallen yet. But the disintegration had already progressed to the point that the Salian Franks and other form of foederati made the roads unsafe. In 451, Attila the Hun was rampaging around the province. And already known for her holiness, Genevieve organized prayer vigils, and Attila never did sack Lutetia. He sacked many other cities, but he never sacked Paris. 13 years later, age 44, Genevieve enters our story by meeting Clovis. This is before he became the Regnum Francorum, the king of the Franks. His father was still alive, so his father was chieftain of the Franks, and Clovis was fighting with him in essentially a criminal war band. In 464, Childeric and Clovis laid siege to Lutetia, Paris. Growing impatient with the siege, these are barbarians, so siege warfare is, it's no fun. But growing impatient that the city never seemed to run out of food, That was the whole point of laying the siege, that they'd run out of food, then they'd surrender. Their reconnaissance, the Franks sent out reconnaissance, and they discovered that a woman, they didn't know her name at the time, they later found out it was Genevieve, was leading regular sorties out of the city and returning with food from the countryside. Now, each time the scouts saw him in a distance, it wasn't her alone, but her and the group, they'd see him and, oh yeah, okay, they're over there. So the scouts are on top of the hill. They see, oh yeah, okay, that's over there. So then they charge over there, and when they get there, they look around, and then there's nobody there, and they can never find him. Even more irritating, at times they saw her and others rowing boats in a river with supplies. And it's okay, there they are, and then we'll go get them. So then they charge, they go through the forest, they find the river. And when they made it to the banks of the river, they didn't see anybody. And they never figured it out. They never figured out how she did it, how she slipped in and out of the city without being seen. But the supplies of food enabled the leaders of Lutetia to secure terms with they eventually did surrender, but on terms, so the city was not sacked. Afterwards, Clovis met Genevieve. As they knew somebody was doing this, and then they wanted to say, okay, we want to meet the person who was doing this, and then that's how he met Genevieve. And he left with a lifelong respect for her. She never told him. Of course, he wanted to know, okay, how did you do it? Well, no, she never did tell him. But Clovis, Childeric first, he was still alive, he was the chieftain, and then Clovis after, did allow her to secure release of prisoners through because remember, these people are criminals, so it was the practice of Freikauf, or essentially ransom, that they had prisoners, and if from the captured in the countryside as they were laying siege to the city. So if a captured prisoner had money, if the family had money, then the family could buy them, pay the Freikauf, and buy their freedom, pay ransom and buy their freedom. But if the family did not have money, then the prisoner would just be sold as a slave. Because it's the 5th century, and life sucked. But they allowed Genevieve to raise, of course she didn't have any money, but she said she had to raise money to pay the Freikauf, literally buying the freedom of many innocent people who otherwise would have spent their lives as slaves. For her own spiritual nourishment, St. Genevieve had a devotion to St. Well, it's spelled Denis, D-E-N-I-S. I suppose the French would say Saint Denis, who was the founding bishop and another patron saint of Paris. Denis, D-E-N-I-S, that is the contracted French rendering of the name Dionysius. Dionysius, the person who was the founding bishop, he was a Greek convert to Christianity, sent to Roman Gaul by Pope Fabian to preach the gospel in the 3rd century. Saint Denis, or Denis, I'll just call him Denis just for the, to anglicize it, was designated by the Pope, ordained founding bishop by the Pope. Denis and his 6 companions settled in Lutetia, which to preach to the surrounding tribe, the Parisi. So that's how Lutetia eventually came to be called Paris. Saints Denis, Eleutherius, and Rusticus settled on what is later and still is called the Ile de Cité. It's an island in the River Seine. At the time, the Romans, the Roman Lutetia, was on the higher ground on the left bank of the river. So they settled on the island of the river, which is a poor section. When the missionaries' success at winning converts from paganism alarmed the local Druids, they stoked homicidal antipathy against these outsiders, leading to their martyrdom by beheading during the persecution of the Emperor Decius around the year 250. The place of their execution is still called Martyrs' Mountain. This is Montmartre in Paris, Martyrs' Mountain. It's the highest point in the city. Now there's a huge church there, a huge white Sacré-Cœur, that was built much later in the 19th century. But Montmartre is the Mountain of the Martyrs. There are two accounts about what happened to their remains. One of the accounts is that the remains, the head and the bodies, were simply pitched in the river. And from the river, other Christians recovered the remains and interred them at the time outside of the city, in what is now a neighborhood of the city, Saint-Denis. It's on their metro, their Paris subway. There's a metro stop there, Saint-Denis, Saint-Denis. And a small martyrion, a small shrine on the spot marked where the remains were buried for pilgrims. So fast forwarding back to St. Genevieve, in 475, St. Genevieve raised funds from among the faithful and from Clovis, even though he was still pagan at this point. He respected her personally, to build a church on the spot, dedicated to Saint Denis and his companions. And it remained a site for devotion and religious practice and pilgrimage. And so we'll leave it there. It's going to re-enter our story later. So we have the original founding, then St. Genevieve, and then we're going to meet it later, because the Merovingians are going to do something else with it that is going to affect history. In 493, Clovis married St. Clotilde, forming a political alliance between the Merovingian Franks and the Scandinavian Burgundians. Clotilde, at the time, was Catholic. Clovis was pagan. But part of the arrangement was that Clotilde would be allowed to practice her faith. When she arrived in Lutetia, it had relapsed to paganism. Remember, under the empire, it was all Christian. It had all been converted. But as the Franks came in, and they're pagan, so the city had largely relapsed into paganism. She felt frightened. She felt bereft, until she found comfort from the 71-year-old Saint Genevieve. And together they visited Genevieve said, well, when I need comfort, this is where I go, to visit the shrine of Saint Denis. And so she brought Clotilde there. This solace was all the more cherished when Clotilde lost her first child shortly after birth and was bitterly blamed for it by her husband. It is not known if Genevieve ever revealed to Clotilde the trick, how she managed to keep the city supplied. But if she did reveal it, Clotilde also never told. I guess it was a girl thing, girls talk. 3 years after his marriage to Clotilde, bringing us to the year 496, King Clovis the Frank engaged another Germanic tribe in battle. These are the Alemanni. They were across the Rhine River in what is now Germany. And they made such an impression that the French word for German is Allemand. So they were, at the time, they were on the upper Rhine River. Clovis had previously, up to this point, he had resisted converting from paganism to his wife's Catholic faith, especially after the death of their first child. But after he achieved victory over the Alemanni at the Battle of Tolbiac, and that's present-day Zülpich, that's 37 miles east of the current German-Belgian border. So it's Westphalia. It's in Westphalia, Germany. After that victory, which was a near thing. I mean, Clovis almost lost that battle, but he ended up winning it. So after that, Clovis agreed to baptism. Like the previously covered successor kings, Odoacer the Ostrogoth and Theodoric the Visigoth, Clovis endeavored to maintain good relations with the old imperials to stabilize his position. One member of that group of the old imperials was descended from the patrician family, and he's now known as Saint Remigius, or Saint Remy. He served as Bishop of Reims from 459 to 533. And it was Saint Remigius who baptized Clovis, a Catholic, in the Cathedral of Reims on Christmas Eve, December 24th, 496, along with 3,000 other Frankish warriors. St. Remigius pioneered a survival strategy for the church in that transition between the, because Remigius was born in 459. So the West, he was born in the empire, there was still an emperor. So he was, 17? He was 17 when the last emperor was deposed. And like others, he thought, well, okay, we'll get another one, or maybe the Eastern emperor will just take over. So, time passed. Eventually, it penetrated that it was over with. So he's in this transition where the old imperials, some tried to put up a fight, like Syagrius, and they ended up getting defeated. There just weren't enough of them. So what do we do? Do we continue fight and just get picked off one by one, or do we, make some kind of deal? Essentially collaborate. And Remigius was one who chose the latter strategy. And other old imperials, as we've seen in Spain and Italy, reached the same conclusion. Remigius convinced Clovis that his endeavor to pacify the local population and create a larger, ever larger kingdom, a regnum francorum, would be facilitated by making use of the old imperials. Because these people were literate, they were cultivated, they knew how to govern, they knew how to keep records, they knew how to organize things, they knew how to repair roads, they knew how to repair the aqueducts, none of which the Franks knew how to do because they were barbarians. They were just criminals, essentially a gang. They knew how to kill, they knew how to steal, they knew how to burn, but that's it. They weren't builders. Now Clovis, even though he wasn't a literate thug in many ways, he wasn't stupid. I mean, he was uneducated, but he wasn't stupid. And he realized, okay, that's true. In order to achieve his ambitions, this would be a better way. So Remigius was able to create a network of other people like him, old imperials, old Gallo-Romans, that enabled the church to survive in this period, in this transition period. Moreover, because of the secure position this strategy created for them, and they were Catholic, of course, they were able to evangelize. Eventually, they were able to convert the barbarians. Again, just as their ancestors had converted the Roman Empire, so now they and their descendants would convert the successor kingdoms, including the Franks. Examples, others that were personal friends of Remigius: Saints Medard and Gildard. They were twins, born into an ethnically mixed family. Their father was a Frank, their mother was a Gallo-Roman, so they were bicultural. They were perfect ambassadors for Remigius's network. Gildard became Bishop of Rouen in 488. Medard became Bishop of Vermandois in 490. But that see was moved to Noyon in 531, and we're going to meet a later bishop of that city shortly. These two brothers did something else, another contribution to the growing Merovingian church. They gave shelter to a runaway who is now a saint, Saint Radegund. Radegund was born the daughter of a German Thuringian pagan. She was captured in the course of one of the endless fighting. They're barbarians. That's just what they do. So she was captured in a raid. She was kept, I suppose the polite way to say is, in a harem of the enemy tribe. And I'll leave it at that. Eventually she escaped and just on the run. And just by happenstance, or by grace, she encountered Saint Medard. So he and his brother heard her story, got her, food and shelter, and of course she grew up pagan, so she didn't. And Germany had never been part of the empire where she was from, so it's entirely possible she had never even heard of Catholicism. But she did, and over time she embraced the faith. She was baptized, and she wanted to help others like herself. And so they helped her by establishing a convent under the patronage of the Holy Cross for others like her, women who had suffered like her and wanted to, escape and then spend the rest of their life in religion. It was established at Poitiers. This is significant historically because it is the first convent that opened religious life to women born in barbarian tribes, from outside of what had been the Roman Empire. And this is only 12 years after the Empire in the West fell. So it's growing. It's another part of the Merovingian, church. Okay, so because Clovis's conversion is so important, here are the contemporary accounts of his conversion. Quote, Clovis took to wife Clotilde, daughter of the king of the Burgundians. Now Clotilde was Christian. When her first son was born, she wished to consecrate him by baptism, and begged her husband unceasingly, saying, The gods whom thou honorest are nothing. They cannot help themselves nor others, for they are carved from stone or from wood or from metal. The names which you have given them were of men, not of gods. Like Saturn, who is said to have escaped by flight, to avoid being deprived of his power by his son. And like Jupiter, foul perpetrator of all uncleanliness. What power have Mars and Mercury ever had? They are endowed with magical arts rather than divine power. The God who should be worshipped is he who by his word created from nothingness the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them. He who made the sun to shine and adorned the sky with stars, who filled the water with creeping things, the land with animals, the air with winged creatures, by whose bounty the earth is glad with crops, the trees with fruit, the vines with grapes, by whose hand the human race was created, whose bounty has ordained that all things should give homage and service to man, whom God created. But when the queen had said these things, the mind of Clovis was not stirred to believe. He answered, By the will of our gods, all things are created and are produced. Evidently your God can do nothing. It is not even proved that he belongs to the race of gods. Meantime, the faithful queen presented her son for baptism. She had the church adorned with tapestry, seeking to attract by this splendor him who her exhortations had failed to move. But the child, whom they named Ingamar, after he had been born again through baptism, died in his white baptismal robe. Then the king reproached the queen bitterly. If the child had been consecrated in the name of my gods, he would still be alive. But now, because he is baptized in the name of your God, he cannot live. After this, another son was born to him, and called in baptism Clodomir. He fell very ill. Then the king said, because he, like his brother, was baptized in the name of Christ, he will die soon. But the mother prayed, and by God's will, the child recovered. The queen unceasingly urged the king to acknowledge the true God and forsake idols. But he could not in any way be brought to believe until a war broke out against the Alemanni. Then he was by necessity compelled to confess what he had before willfully denied. It happened that the two armies were in battle, and there was great slaughter. Clovis's army was near to utter destruction. He saw the danger. His heart was stirred. He was moved to tears. And he raised his eyes to heaven, saying, Jesus Christ, whom Clotilde declares to be the Son of the living God, who it is said, give us aid to the oppressed, and victory to those who put their hope in thee. I beseech the glory of thy aid. If thou shalt grant me victory over these enemies, and I test that power which people consecrated to thy name, say they have proved concerning thee, I will believe in thee, and be baptized in thy name. For I have called upon my gods, but, as I have proved, they are far removed from my aid. So I believe that they have no power, for they do not succor those who serve them. Now I call upon thee, and I long to believe in thee, all the more that may escape my enemies. When he had said these things, the Alemanni turned their backs and began to flee. When they saw that their king was killed, they submitted to the sway of Clovis, saying, we wish that no more people should perish. Now we are thine. When the king had forbidden further war, and praised his soldiers, he told the queen how he had won the victory by calling on the name of Christ. Then the queen sent to the blessed Remigius, bishop of the city of Rheims, praying him to bring to the king the gospel of salvation. The priest, little by little, led him to believe in the true God, maker of heaven and earth, and to forsake idols, which could not help him nor anyone else. But the king said, willingly will I hear thee, O father, but one thing is in the way, that the people who follow me are not content to leave their gods. I will go and speak to them, according to thy word. When he came among them, the power of God went before him, and before he had spoken, all the people cried out together, we cast off mortal gods, O righteous king, and we are ready to follow the God whom Remigius tells us is immortal. These things were told to the bishop. He was filled with joy, and ordered the font to be prepared. The streets were shaded with embroidered hangings. The churches were adorned with white tapestries. The baptistry was set in order. The odor of balsam spread around. Candles gleamed, and all the temple of the baptistry was filled with divine odor. Then the king confessed that God, omnipotent in the Trinity, and was baptized in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost, and was anointed with the sacred chrism, with the sign of the cross of Christ. Of his army there were baptized more than 3,000. A Visigoth named Alaric II, at the time, was calling himself King of Tolosa. That's the Roman name for Toulouse in southern France. He regarded the success of Clovis the Frank in northern France and in western Germany as an affront to his honor that diminished his prestige among his own warriors. Violence ensued that culminated in the Battle of Vienne. Not Vienna. Vienna is in Austria. This is Vienne. Vienne. That is 20 miles south of Lyon on the Rhone River. The battle occurred in 507 AD. Clovis defeated and killed Alaric, absorbing his kingdom and adding it to the Regnum Francorum, to the kingdom of the Franks. thereby extending the southern border of France, of what would become France, to include Aquitaine in the south. So remember, Clovis is up here. Paris. So here's Paris up here, and so by conquest, he had when he defeated so he's from up here in Belgium, and then by conquest, this is Austrasia, and then by conquest he added Neustria, which was the defended by Syagrius, the last of the Gallo-Romans, and then south of the let's see, this print is so small. Okay, so here's the Loire River. So here's Tours and Orléans. So south of the Loire, this was the Visigoth kingdom. So in 507, when he defeated them at the Battle of Vienne, which is on the Rhone River. Okay. This print is so small. Okay, so here's the Rhone. Here's Lyon. Follow the river down, and there's Vienne. That's where the battle took place. And so then Clovis extends all the way to the south, all the way to the Pyrenees. South down here now. He did not have all of France yet, because there's Burgundy is still here, eastern France and Switzerland. But still, it's quite the swath of territory. This Franco-Visigoth war that culminated in the Battle of Vienne in 507 was devastating to the population of southern France. One practice that continued is the barbarian criminal practice of holding prisoners of war as hostages for frikau, for ransom. Another Visigoth saint, Merovingian saint, who came to public prominence because of this was Saint Caesarius of Arles. On today's maps, it's Arles is A-R-L-E-S. On the old imperial maps, it was Arelate. Yeah, so there's Arles. So this is in Septimania. This whole Arles. We have contemporary chronicles, let's see, describing this, how these people were treated. Essentially slavery, prisoners of war, slavery, they often overlapped. So here's a chronicle from a chronicle of William of Malmesbury. This is England, but it's of a piece. He explained that Canute's sister, that's a long story, but, quote, she was killed by a stroke of lightning, for it is reported that she was in the habit of purchasing companies of slaves in England and sending them into Denmark, more especially girls, whose beauty and age rendered them more valuable, that she might accumulate money by this horrid trade. Another example is from the life of St. Wulfstan. Quote, there is a maritime town called Bristol, which is on the direct route to Ireland, and so suited for trade with that barbarian land. The inhabitants of this place, with other Englishmen, often sailed to Ireland for the sake of trade. Wulfstan banished from among them a very old custom, which had so hardened their hearts that neither the love of God nor the love of King William could efface it. For men whom they had purchased from all over England, they carried off to Ireland. But first they got the women with child and sent them pregnant to market. You would have seen queues of the wretches of both sexes shackled together, and you would have pitied them. Those who were beautiful and those who were in the flower of youth were daily prostituted and sold amidst much wailing. O execrable crime, wretched dishonor, men who remind us of beasts, to sell into slavery their nearest relative for the sake of lucre, of money. And third, this is from the work of St. Gregory of Tours, who was also a historian, and he was a contemporary. He actually knew some of these people, the Merovingians. So this is from Book 3, Chapter 15. Quote, "But Theodoric and Childebert entered into a treaty, and each took an oath that neither would wage war neither would wage war upon the other." That's well, anyway, this is about something else. They took hostages so that they might the more firmly adhere to what they had promised. Many sons of senatorial families were thus given, but when a new quarrel broke out between the kings, they were reduced to servitude on the fiscal domains, and those who had taken care of them now made slaves of them. Nevertheless, many escaped by flight and returned to their own country, while others were kept in servitude, among whom was Attalus, nephew of the Blessed Gregory, Bishop of Langres, who was made a public slave and put in charge of the horses. He was the servant of a captain, a certain Frankish barbarian, living in the district of Treves. Finally, the Blessed Gregory, meaning his uncle, sent his men to inquire about the youth. They found him and offered gifts to his master, who rejected them, saying, "One of such family ought to be redeemed with 10 pounds of gold." Okay, well, I'll read this. There's one more. This is a letter from the Pope, Gregory III, writing to the Archbishop of Mainz. Quote, "Among other crimes committed in those parts, you have mentioned this, that certain of the faithful sell their slaves to the pagans for sacrifices." The somatomancy, blood magic, so, human sacrifice. "Which thing, brother, we think should be corrected. And we do not think you should allow it to proceed further, for it is a disgrace and an impiety. To those, therefore, who have done these things, you should mete out the same punishment as for homicide." Okay, now I wanted to say something about that mention of 10 pounds of gold. What a ridiculous statement that was in his time. So the coin of the day, the gold coin of the day, was the solidus, which was, let's see, the solidus was 1/72 of a pound of gold. So in other words, from a pound of gold, they would mint 72 solidi, 72 of those gold coins. So this guy wanted 10 pounds for one slave. So that's 10 times 72, so 720 gold coins. That's how much he wanted to ransom. And also note from that, when they said, he said that it was sons of senatorial families. So Theodoric and Childebert were Franks, but the hostages were senatorial families, patricians, which means they were old imperials. So the Franks were taking the conquered population, the old imperials, and using them in this way. So this places in context how important the work St. Remigius did to lift the conquered Gallo-Romans from being a subject, not even a second class, but I mean to just being just a small step above slavery, and many of them actually reduced to slavery. So he doesn't get the credit historically that he deserves, because the Merovingian period was so chaotic. But he should be remembered, and he did much good. All right, with this background, we can return to the next Merovingian saint we mentioned, Saint Caesarius of Arles. He was born in Chalon. He was he was of mixed ethnicity, like Medard and Gildard. His father was a Gallo-Roman, Old Imperial, but his mother was Burgundian, Scandinavian. The Burgundians who controlled his place of birth, he was born in 468. So again, he was born when there was still an emperor in the West. He was 8 years old when the last emperor was deposed. So the Burgundians at the time of his birth were pagan. So as an adolescent, Caesarius left home. He left Chalon and entered a monastery on an island of Lorraine. It's an island in the Mediterranean. He enjoyed monastic life, but he left. He felt he had to leave because he was having continued disputes with the other monks on a point of theology of grace, with regard to a movement that was called semi-Pelagianism. Semi-Pelagianism was a theological assertion that had not yet been condemned by the church. Eventually it would be. It's a heresy. But at the time it had not been. So semi-Pelagianism, this is a heresy. I almost hate to say what it is because I don't want... But semi-Pelagianism is the erroneous assertion that the initial act of faith is made by our free will alone. And only, like, we don't need God's grace for that. And only after we make that decision, then we need God's grace to continue living it out in the world. Now, it's called semi-Pelagianism because the original Pelagianism asserted that we don't need God's grace at all. It was a rejection of it. Pelagius didn't believe in original sin. So he believed we don't need God's grace. Like, we can save ourselves. We can be good. We can save ourselves. We don't need God's grace. So that's just stupid. But Pelagianism was condemned, of course, quite properly in the 5th century. But semi-Pelagianism was another version, modified version of that tried to retain that egocentric idea, that the initial act of faith, like our act, our choice, our existential choice, is what defines, our faith. We can do that on our own. And only then do we need God's grace. It's like nourishment. So eventually that would be condemned because we need God's grace for everything. But at the time it had not been. But Caesarius knew it was wrong. He just sensed intuited that this was wrong. But the other monks, believed it. So anyway, he left Lorraine. Wandered around for a while until he came upon a more amenable Orthodox monastery in Arelate, which is now Arles. Time passed, he became abbot of that monastery. Because of his learning, and because his father was of the Gallo-Roman aristocracy, he was soon contacted by members of the network being built and expanded and organized by St. Remigius, resulting in Caesarius becoming bishop of Arelate in 502. From there, as bishop, he got to see more of the world and communicate more. And in that position, he learned of the plight of many who were kidnapped and held as slave hostages during the war that ended in 507. So he began raising money to pay the Freikauf, the ransom. Initially, he focused on Gallo-Romans because they were Catholic, and they could end up being slaves to pagans, which could mean human sacrifice. It could mean many other things I won't describe. But then when he would go to these markets, he would notice that there were many captured Visigoths who, of course, lost the war. Clovis defeated them. Who had no one who was going to ransom them, either because their friends and family were also captured, or they were dead in the war, or they ran away. As the Visigoths still controlled Spain, so they were just going to spend the rest of their lives as slaves. So he started ransoming them. This, ransoming the former enemy, the Visigoths, the former enemy of the Franks, resulted in Caesarius being accused of being a Visigoth spy against the conquering Franks. St. Remigius was furious with him for jeopardizing the fragile symbiosis he was fostering between the barbarian overlords and the subjected Gallo-Romans. Now, Caesarius didn't really care about the political arrangement, but he did have to flee the city for a time. And he did so by disguising himself as a cripple, knowing that that would ensure that he would be totally ignored. Eventually, he was captured, but after examination and after testimony from many on his behalf, including Franks, the Clovis was convinced that his motives were religious and not political. One reason that stability never lasted long was the perennial jealousy fostered by barbarian culture. The success of a neighboring tribe was regarded as impugning the honor of one's own tribe, because it suggested that the other tribe was stronger, and it demanded that the more successful tribe be attacked. So it's just like gangs, a successful gang, oh, they got this territory, so okay, we have to go and murder them. So and this, according to these ethos, successful slaughter of males from another tribe, or at least stealing from them, restored one's honor. So you kind of proved, okay, we're the baddest, we're the strongest. Even more honorable, according to this warped ethos, would be kidnapping their women and possibly even settling in their land. As if you did enough, then you take their land. If you kidnap their women and reproduce with their women, then you breed the enemy out of existence. This pre-conversion cultural pattern instilled into barbarian society emotional dynamics that made them consistently vulnerable to demonic manipulation, using the sins of wrath, greed, envy, pride. Satan would use them to great effect to eventually bring, against the church, for the many church-state disputes that are eventually coming. 4 years after conquering the Visigoth kingdom of Tolosa, thereby reunifying much of old Roman Gaul, not all of it, but much of it, under Merovingian control, Clovis granted the request of St. Remigius and summoned the first national synod in the Merovingian period. This one was held at Aurelianum, which is Orleans now. And so we'll pause there. We'll stop the session there, and we'll pick up next time with this first Council of Orleans, which met in the year 511. Okay. So, maybe. Okay, that's it. All right. Thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.